Hi everyone and welcome back to Snippit Sports Science Podcast, proudly brought to you by eliteform.com. I'm Chris Cavillio and once again here with Jared Coleman-Stark. How are you today, mate?
Excellent. How are you doing, Chris?
Very well, thank you. And I've got a challenge for all you listeners out there. We're really grateful for your patronage and listening to our podcast every week. And we really want to try and grow this a little bit more this year. So our challenge to you is to go onto iTunes and give us a rating. This is really important for us because it helps to rate the podcast, to grow the podcast. And we know that you listen to us because we've got some really great feedback from everyone on our social media and we've got some really good listeners on our stats. So go to iTunes and give us a good rating would be really great and a few little comments. And that will obviously help grow our podcast this year.
Absolutely. The more people we reach, the more we can help with good sports science principles and healthy practice for all.
Now moving on to our review article, and this one's once again from Martyn Beaven, Liam Kilduff and Christian Cook Group, and we're looking at lower limb passive heat maintenance combined with pre-cooling improves repeated sprint ability. This is perhaps almost the culmination of a lot of this passive heat maintenance work that this group has done over the time. When you look at the concept of how passive heat maintenance has grown over time, that we've reviewed a couple of papers previously, in particular the one with heated jackets and swimming by Courtney McGowan.
Right.
And when you look at some of the other work done with Christian Cook and Co., they traditionally started to look at just how passive heat maintenance can affect or can improve athletic performance. So from an outset, what we're talking about here is something as simple as a reflective jacket. And when you look at the performance across different environmental conditions, when you look at something like, say, 15, 25, 35 degrees, 15 degree depends on where you live in the world. 15 in our northern hemisphere might be more might be something more realistic in a team sport environment, whereas we move to that southern hemisphere where 25, even 35 degrees in the middle of summer is probably more realistic.
Oh, even 40 degrees. Particularly a lot of our athletes training in warehouses because they need the space and the affordable building for their training. As all the time they'll get to 40 degrees in a lot of commercial clubs.
Yeah. And the big thing here that we find is that heat in the muscle is important. For every degree change in muscle temperature, there's about a 4 to 8% change in power. And how that affects performance is we look at repeat sprint performance, that the hotter the muscle, by maintaining that muscle heat or environmental conditions, your first sprints are always faster, but this comes at a cost to the body. So if you're at a hotter temperature, 35, 40 degrees, your last sprints are a lot slower because you're just fatigued. So conversely, at those cooler temperatures, your first sprints aren't as fast, but you've obviously increased your muscle temp. So by the end there, you haven't had the fatigue from a hot body or hot muscles, and also you've actually warmed up over each one. This work obviously started at that 25 degree type mark, and they started to then think about the concept of, well, we've got warm muscles, but it's come in at a cost. They started to look at the role of keeping the core nice and cool, because that's obviously helping to negate the negative effects of the hot temperatures. So that concept of adding a slushie when it's really hot to look at trying to attenuate the loss in performance. And they actually started to find that when you could add that to the body, it decreases the physiological cost and potentially has some sort of cooling effect so that, it mitigates their performance loss at warmer temperatures. I think this here really starts to combine, well, what happens at a temperature when you start combining all these different ones. So what happens when it's a slushy by itself? What happens when it's passive heat maintenance by itself? But more importantly, what happens when you start to combine the two together? And it's starting to be a lot smarter with combining all the different findings that these people have found. So really, if we could encapsulate this, we could call it warm muscles, cool core. Say that one quickly. I think that's a bit of a tongue twister.
It is a bit of a tongue twister, but it is the conclusion of a very comprehensive story that people are able to pull out of this group of articles that we've been going through. that there's clear evidence that warm muscle, cool core is the best physiological athlete for most performance. Is you want the muscles to be warm, but heating obviously comes at the expense of also heating the core, which can result in more fatigue. And so you want interventions to be able to cool the core. The secondary effect that most people don't consider is that when you do heat the muscles and you have the improved performance on the back of that, you are more fatigued because you just completed higher intensity exercise with the greater speed with the warm muscles, and that produces more fatigue as well.
Exactly right. And this actually builds on some of your own work where you looked at environmental temperatures on squat performance. You found that at the warmer temperatures, their power outputs and their bar velocities, and these are elite Olympic standard lifters, were able to perform better and had a corresponding testosterone response as well, which was really interesting. And just kind of backs that same information that at these warmer temperatures, your body just performs better.
Right, but that's also why I took the intermittent approach to the heating, where I would heat the athletes immediately prior to their exercise so that their muscles could warm more effectively and perform the exercise at a greater velocity, but then also pulled them out of the heat into a cool environment during the rest period so that their core would have the ability to cool down in between those high intensity sets.
So we know that if we use a passive heat maintenance strategy, we're able to maintain muscle temperature, which helps improve performance. However, taking into consideration that we've got to ensure that the environmental temperatures aren't too fatiguing on top of the muscle temperature and improving performance. So using the slushy in those colder temps or to maintain cool core, and also using a passive heat maintenance strategy to maintain muscle temperature. Now, Jared, you want to just go through it?
Right, so moving into the methods of this study, it was a random crossover design using 12 professional athletes. So that means that each of these 12 athletes completed all of the conditions for the study. There were 4 conditions, so that means that there were effectively 48 trials within this study. So a lot of studies, what they'll do is they'll report n equals 24, but then they split those 2 groups of athletes into 2 different groups and only have 12 athletes in each group. Whereas this study has taken 12 athletes and had them complete every single condition so that they can directly compare within an individual athlete what is that individual athlete's response to the different conditions. Because we know it's at the professional sport level, you cannot compare between the different athletes. They're too far standard deviations away from group averages. You can't treat these people as group averages. So those 4 conditions were the control condition, where there was a 15-minute period where they just had passive rest at the beginning of the intervention, whereas in the 3 intervention conditions, during that 15-minute period, there was either heating, cooling, or both the heating and cooling. The heating in this condition was a lower body survival garment, so that's essentially pants that have a reflective material on the inside that reflect the infrared radiation from your legs and put that heat back towards you. The cooling condition was a 500 milliliter ice slushy, so that's what's commonly been observed to be the most effective for decreasing core temperature. I do have a small criticism of those findings because we typically measure core temperature out of the digestive system, and an ice slushy obviously cools the digestive system. So how effectively is it cooling the rest of the core, the heart and the lungs and the rest of the organs? It's not known. It just makes sense that ice slushy in the digestive system would cool the digestive system, which we take to be the gold standard for core temperature. The final condition was the heating plus the cooling, which combined both the reflective pants and the ice slushy.
And during this, heart rate and rectal temperature was collected at 3 different time points, and this was prior to the warm-up, prior to the repeat sprint activity, and upon completion of the repeat sprint. So once again, the repeat sprint activity was 5 40-meter maximal sprint efforts every 30 seconds.
And of course, our real primary performance measure in this study is how quickly did the athletes complete those sprints? What was their sprinting speed? And secondarily, what is the fatigue index that arose from those sprint times? So what was the slowest minus the fastest, or actually in this case it might have been the last minus the first.
Correct, yeah. And all these were done in a controlled gymnasium environment at 25 degrees and 60% humidity. It's important here to note the temperature, it's important here to note the environmental temperature that they are working at, because then if we're taking these findings into the applied field, we want to ensure that we know the results according to the temperature they're using and then what we're actually working with.
Right, and it's very important that this is a controlled environment, or at least that we know the range of temperatures under which these interventions were undertaken. And of course, the findings of this would vary if they were in a different environment. So if it's in a hotter environment, it will skew favorability towards the cooling conditions, whereas if it's in a colder environment, it will skew the results to benefit the heating interventions, because that's the overall conditions that would be most beneficial.
And from a methodology point of view, so the athletes came in, they had just 20 minutes, they called it acclimation. They came in, they got ready for their activities, and that was
at the gym.
Yeah, in a 20-minute period. And obviously ensures that their bodies acclimatized to the 25-degree gymnasium.
Right, they've come in from outdoors where it could have been any temperature.
Or running around, running late.
Exactly.
Then they perform an active warm-up for 10 minutes, so that takes them to 30 minutes. And at this point here, the intervention is put in place. Controlled, heating pants, slushy, or the combination. And then from this point after 15 minutes, they do their 5 40-meter sprints with 30 seconds. And then after the intervention, they perform their repeat sprint efforts, which was 5 40 meters on every 30 seconds.
I would just like to point out that that repeated sprint effort is a very hot metabolic sort of exercise. It's not like heavy lifting with 6 minutes rest in between each set. They're going on the 30 seconds, so there's very little rest, very high speed, very high intensity.
This was done across 5 sessions, and where the 5th session is, they actually did 2 control sessions at any time point, and they actually found that there was no differences between these 2 different controls. So therefore they took the average of this data and they put it into the table for the comparison of the results. Which on this point, let's just talk about the results now, Jared.
Right, well, I did want to touch on the second control session a bit, because I think that's something that needs to be done much more in sports science. I just want to highlight that as a beautiful, exceptional methodology in sports science. And it's a common issue with sports science that you come back week after week for the testing because you need the washout period in the acute studies, and you come to the end of it, and there's always a question of, was there a training adaptation over the course of the study? And so I think it's extremely beneficial to have that second control group, second control session, and that's something that at considerable expense of the subjects and the researchers' effort. And so they've clearly put in a lot of effort into the study to make it a very high quality study. So finally, moving into the results, the first thing I really just want to highlight is, where did we see the slowest and the fastest sprint times across those 5 different sprints? And so I'm just immediately interested in what were the fastest ones. And we see that in the beginning, in the first 2 sprints, it's the heated condition with the hot pants that has the fastest speeds, closely followed by the heating plus cooling. There's really a negligible difference for the heating plus cooling versus the heating. But we see in those first 2 that the heat is the best. And then after that, for sprints 3 through 5, the heating plus the cooling becomes the best. There's a shift from the heating being the best to the heating plus the cooling being the best. Looking at the slowest times, in the beginning, the slowest times for those first 2 sprints are the cold condition. The athletes come in and they're a bit too cold, and they actually have a slower time than the control. Whereas on the 3rd sprint, it becomes balanced, where actually the control condition is the slowest. And then for sprints 4 and 5, the heated condition is clearly by far the slowest sprints. So we see a reverse shift from the fastest times, as we see the slowest times shift from the cold condition in the beginning to the heated condition is the worst at the end. And that's exactly what we would expect from what we highlighted on the benefits of the heating towards your initial ability to produce intensity, but then the subsequent fatigue that arises from that.
Just looking at the numbers here, it's amazing. So the heat,
dramatic.
So sprint 1, you went from an average of 5.2 to 6.1 seconds. So it's almost a whole second slower.
Yes.
Whereas if you look at, say, the cold condition, which was slowest in sprint 1, was on an average of 5.43, and only a little bit slower at 5.62.
Well, if you look at the cumulative times for these different conditions, we see that the best cumulative time there was about 26.9 in the heating plus cooling condition across all 5 sprints, the total time that it took to complete those, whereas the slowest was 27.9 with just the heat condition. I think that's quite interesting because if you look at these cumulative numbers, you think certainly the heat would be the worst overall for this event. But we saw that in those first 2 sprints, it was actually the best condition. So I don't think this should be extrapolated. Oh, the heating is the worst for the sprinting. Actually, the heating was the best for the first 2 sprints, but then became so fatiguing by the end that it resulted in the largest cumulative total of time.
And once again, context. This is 540 meters. If you have an athlete doing a 1-out effort, it's heat. If you have an athlete who's on the field for 80 minutes continually and they have that part-time break or they come off the field and they have interchange, that's the consideration where they're doing more than 540 meter efforts as well. So context is important.
Right, exactly. And similarly with the fatigue index, we look at these fatigue indexes and the cold clearly has the lowest fatigue index, followed by the heating plus cooling, then control, and then heating has a massive fatigue index. And that's related to what we've just said is the progression of the times over the repeated sprints is heating has a massive fatigue index, not only because they're slower at the end, but also because they're much faster at the beginning. So if someone just looks at fatigue index and they're like, oh, cold prevents fatigue, it's only part of the story.
And in terms of temperature and heart rate, anything there to note?
As we would expect, the cooler conditions had lower heart rates and lower rectal temperatures, whereas the hotter conditions had higher heart rates and higher rectal temperatures. I think more than anything, that's just an expression of, well, did these interventions actually have the direct effects that we thought that they would? It's just a methodological confirmation more than anything. Although it could, of course, relate to the specific effects within each of those. Your heart rate's going higher, your rectal temperature is higher, you're going to be generating more fatigue. What do you think of those results, Chris?
Again, I think this is a culmination of really great work here done by this group. They've brought together a couple of good concepts that we need to take into consideration for our athletes here. It really shows something that's simple that we can do ourselves as a practitioner or as an SSC coach, that heat intervention has that enhanced initial sprint performance, but has that performance decrement towards the end there. Whereas that cold intervention negatively impacts upon that initial sprint performance, but imparts a degree of fatigue resistance towards the end there. And it's the combination of 2 together, which is what we obviously saw as our best result.
All right, so what we see with that combination of the ice slurry ingestion and the localized muscle temperature maintenance is that there's enhanced initial sprint speed, overall greater work capacity, and greater fatigue resistance. We see that it's probably because there's that increase in muscle temperature, which improves contractile function, but also decreases that core temperature and staves off the central fatigue that would result from that.
A couple of proposed mechanisms they actually talk about here in respect to the performance enhancements is a potential elevated rate of adenosine triphosphate or ATP turnover and a potential muscle fiber conduction velocity in type 2A fibers, where there could be a rightward shift in the power velocity relationship also in the type 1 muscle fibers. This also could have potential benefit effects on contractility, viscosity, and the rate of enzymatic and metabolic processes. And as Jared would probably be able to go into much more detail, when you have a hotter temperature in the muscles, that obviously increases the processes which are related to improved performance.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people forget about, they probably learned this in high school, but what is the actual measurement of temperature? Temperature is simply a measurement of how quickly molecules are moving. And so obviously you'd imagine if, from a bottom-up perspective, if molecules are moving faster, then chemical reactions, biochemical reactions can occur more quickly, and you see these enzymes functioning more quickly, you have your ion channels opening and closing more quickly. Any sort of these reactions can simply occur more quickly because these interactions happen faster and with a greater frequency, and thus results in overall faster contractile velocity.
And bringing in the whole rectal temperature in respect to proposed mechanisms such as seen in the heat, which significantly and negatively affected repeat running performance, which also showed the highest fatigue index, shows that it has a positive relationship between performance decrement and rectal temperature. So as I spoke about earlier, those proposed mechanisms, it could be apparent that an increase in the ATP depletion and a shift towards a metabolic profile consistent with less fatigue-resistant muscle fiber type has the potential to impact repeat sprint performance.
Right, and that's moving into the relatively unanswered question of what is fatigue really at the end of the day? We have this giant collection of signals, both sensation and physiological, mental. We have the internal signals of, you've got that little bit of chatter in your head, like, can I go faster? Can I not go faster? It's all those things really accumulate into an overall signal that we call fatigue that either drives or inhibits performance.
And it's interesting there you said that feedback mechanism there. It also could be inferred that, that the affect feedback system could be at play here. And that could be an important consideration also with respect to the efficacy of a pre-cooling strategy, such as a vest intervention that provides the least sensory information. Therefore, it may not provide that same kind of feedback.
Right.
Other people have spoken about that a pre-cooling strategy, such as using an ice pack applied to the neck. We've seen that a lot in sport.
Right, very sensitive, yeah. Boxers always pack the neck with the ice when they come into the corner.
Yeah, and that's actually been shown in other studies to actually improve skill performance.
Right, and so people have actually examined both ends of that spectrum. So on the one end of the spectrum, we have a pure sensation. What's it, a menthol? The menthol creams, you put the menthol cream and it creates that cooling sensation, similar to you chew like certain mints, and they have that cooling sensation. You're not actually being cooler, it's just activating those receptors that tell it, the sensory afferent receptors that tell you that there's cooling happening. It's not actually being cooler. And so people do respond positively to those sensations of cooling that does remove fatigue. But also, my system that I use in some circumstances to cool athletes, the rapid thermal exchange device. What I have is a cooling pad that I apply to the capillary bed at the palm and hand, and it cools the capillary bed. Obviously, that would cause vasoconstriction, and you wouldn't be able to cool the blood effectively, so there's also a vacuum applied, which pulls the blood vessels back open, and then you can effectively cool the blood. The interesting thing about this, and why it's essentially the opposite of the menthol cream, is you don't have temperature receptors in your blood. We just have temperature receptors in our epithelium, like in our skin and whatnot. We only feel temperature in our skin. There's no reason to be feeling it in the blood itself. But by cooling the blood, you can systematically cool the entire person, the entire athlete. And so that then looks at the end of the spectrum where the athlete is being cooled, but without the same sensation. It's been very noted with the rapid thermal exchange device that the athletes don't actually feel cooler, but often feel more energized and refreshed.
That's some interesting points there.
Right, so both play a role.
Yeah, definitely.
Both parts of cooling play a role in removing fatigue.
And they've actually acknowledged that they haven't measured these variables, but they actually went into small detail within their actual discussion about it. And it's something to actually note that you can't capture every single variable out.
They've already clearly put so much effort into this study. It was a huge endeavor. They've got 4 different conditions with an additional control. They've got five conditions with. Were they professional athletes? These were professional athletes, weren't they?
Yeah.
Very difficult to acquire this population and get them to do such a large intervention.
Once again, another great study with some really pragmatic outcomes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Jared, and thanks, listeners. Once again, our challenge to you this week is to go onto iTunes and help us out a little bit, help us grow the podcast so we can make it even better for yourself. Make sure you visit our socials at Snippit Science. If you can't get us on iTunes, you can also listen to us on the website at all the W's, snippetscience.com. Thanks for listening.
And we are always grateful towards our sponsor, eliteform.com.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. Thankfully, this just records in the background.